Welcome to Speed Reads. Today we're going over Fahrenheit 451. Learn the ins and outs of a certified sci-fi classic. Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which paper catches fire. It's also the name of a short novel written by Ray Bradbury. At just over 150 pages in length, the book has left an outsized influence on literature, the science fiction genre, and pretty much any story dealing with a dystopian future. One of the reasons it stayed relevant for so long is that Bradbury's dark vision of the future was prophetic in many ways. This issue of censorship remains as important as ever, as does the idea of rewriting history to suit a political agenda. And the scenario of people being comfortably distracted and numbed by earpods and televised family members becomes less far-fetched with each passing decade. Since the book is cleanly divided into 3 parts, we'll unpack the weighty material in 3 sections that lay out the plot as well as the contemporary issues the author was dealing with at the time. Let's get started. A not-so-simple question. Guy Montag is a fireman. He's part of a crew that answers alarms and rides out in a big red truck. Only in the future world in which Montag lives, firemen start fires, they don't put them out. In particular, firemen burn books. They use devices, called salamanders, that are strapped to their backs, with a long nozzle that spews flames. Why do they burn books? Well, it's the law. Books are prohibited. If a neighbor notices someone with a book, the authorities are called, the firemen show up, and the books are extinguished. At the start of the story, Montag doesn't question his job. He's smiling. He likes the heat and the smell of the kerosene, and the sight of things being consumed and turned to black soot. He enjoys the ritual. But is he really happy? Until now, this isn't something he's thought about. He's smiling, so he assumes he's happy. But then, walking home from work one evening, he runs into a neighbor, a teenage girl by the name of Clarice McClellan. It's an encounter that changes everything. Clarice asks if it's true that once upon a time firemen put out fires. Montag tells her that's nonsense. Houses have always been fireproof, as they are now. Montag is taken aback by Clarice, but in a good way. She's unlike anyone he's ever met, and Clarice's family seems equally strange. She tells him that her uncle and her parents like to sit around and talk. What? Who does this? What do they talk about? Clarice doesn't elaborate, but before they part ways, she asks him one last question. Are you happy? Clarice retreats into the darkness and makes her way back home across the street before Montag can come up with an honest answer. After she's gone, however, Montag can't get the question out of his head. It has prompted him to question his life for the first time. Now that he thinks about it, the answer seems apparent. No, he is not happy. Another thing that's troubling Montag is his wife's condition. When he finally returns home that night, he finds the bedroom dark and tomb-like. His wife, Mildred, is lying on the bed, uncovered, with seashells in her ears. Seashells are small, thimble-sized devices that fit snugly in the ears and offer an endless electronic ocean of music and talk. Mildred always uses the seashells when going to bed, but this night she is especially unresponsive. Even though she's asleep, her eyes are open, fixed on the ceiling. That's when Montag notices that his wife has taken too many sleeping pills. He calls emergency services, who are quickly able to pump Mildred's stomach and give her a blood transfusion. The next morning, Mildred is unfazed. She prepares breakfast as though it were just another day. Montag wonders, was it on purpose or a mistake? Mildred seems confident that she just kept forgetting if she'd taken a pill already, so she took another and another. But Montag isn't so sure. Mildred spends most of her days watching programs in a room called the TV parlor where the television screens fill the walls. She considers the actors in these programs her aunts and uncles, and she finds them deeply comforting. What's discomforting to Montag is that this morning, neither he nor Mildred can remember how they first met. Meanwhile, Montag goes back to work, but it's not the same. Captain Beatty, the boss at the fire station, is also a little concerned. Montag starts to ask weird questions about their job, and Beatty has to reassure his employee that there is nothing unusual about setting fire to books. It's always been done. In fact, as Beatty explains, the job goes all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, America's first fireman who led the charge in burning British-influenced books. Over the next week, Montag continues to run into Clarice in the neighborhood, and she continues to fascinate him. She talks about the sensations of nature, the sights, smells, and textures of the trees and leaves, more things that Montag has never thought about before. Every time they talk, her strange words and behaviors seem to make more sense, and the world seems to open up more and more. But then, just as mysteriously as she appeared, Clarice and her family are gone. This troubling turn of events coincides with a terrible incident at work. In what should have been a routine call, the woman at the house refused to leave her home and instead chose to burn along with her books. The image of the defiant woman going up in flames burns in Montag's brain. The next day, Montag calls in sick. He can't get out of bed, so Captain Beatty pays him a visit. This is a suspenseful scene because, unbeknownst to his wife or anyone else, Montag has begun sneaking books home from work. When Beatty comes calling, there's a book under Montag's pillow. Meanwhile, Beatty tries to bring his employee back into the fold by telling him the whole story of how they got to where they are. Beatty explains that it all started gradually. Books became digests, then the digests were condensed. Hamlet became a one-page entry in a collection of classics. As the nation became more culturally diverse, magazines and all published material became bland, and all of it tried to avoid any controversy at all. The word intellectual became an insult. The people wanted to be happy all the time. This is what made everyone equal, and so they rejected the authors with their disturbing ideas. Clubs, parties, sex, and drugs, what more do people need? This is how Beatty describes the history leading up to the fireman. Having a neighbor with a book was like having a loaded gun next door. Keep the peace, burn the book. Before leaving, Beatty tells Montag that he knows firemen get curious about books. It happens, but Montag shouldn't bother. Fiction books are just made-up nonsense, and non-fiction books are just a bunch of competing ideas that cancel each other out. If a fireman does bring home a book, he can just bring it to the firehouse and incinerate it. All will be forgiven. With that, Beatty leaves. But Beatty's sermonizing doesn't convince Montag. After his boss leaves, he shows his wife the hidden stash of 20 books that he's collected. Mildred is horrified. Her husband pleads with her to be supportive, but she wants nothing to do with these illicit items. She's eager to return to the TV parlor and block out all the unpleasantness. Analysis. This brings us to the end of part 1. There's a lot of world building going on here, so let's try to break some of this down and look at what Bradbury is getting at with this scenario. Perhaps the most important context to Fahrenheit 451 is to remember that it was published in 1953, during the McCarthy era. This was a time of political persecution when having certain books in your possession could lead to accusations of being a communist, being anti-American, and being fired from your job. Not only that, there were calls to burn books written by politically undesirable people. But this was also a time of emerging mass media. Television was still new, and Bradbury relayed an inspiring encounter. In Los Angeles, he saw a husband and wife walking their dog. He noticed that the woman was carrying a portable radio, with an earpiece in her ear, ignoring her husband and listening to the radio as they walked. In a way, Bradbury took both of these influences to their logical extremes. He envisioned a future where all books were banned, and this went hand in hand with a society of individuals who were isolating and distracting themselves with technology. People stopped having conversations about their lives and the world, and they got so far removed from nature that they were unfamiliar with the smell of fallen leaves. Like other dystopian novels, Fahrenheit 451 serves as a warning. It says this is what could happen if we continue to go down a path of censorship and political repression, and place too much value on technology and mass media. Faber and Fire. As the second part of the story begins, Montag is fully immersed in his illicit collection of books. He's enthralled with the beauty of the poetry and the expansive ideas he's reading about. He's now left to wonder how everyone can be so willfully blind to the world around them. At this point, we start to get a better idea of what exactly it is that's happening on a national scale. While Montag is trying to get his wife to join him on his journey of enlightenment, he's also pointing to the bomber planes that are continually roaring overhead, flying to some unknown destination. Why is everyone ignoring the planes? Why isn't anyone curious about who's being bombed? He also mentions the fact that there have been 2 nuclear wars already. Nevertheless, Mildred is defiant. She doesn't want to hear her husband's annoying questions or have anything to do with the books. Desperate for someone to talk to, Montag remembers an old man he met in a park some time ago. When Montag sat down on the bench, the old man, whose name was Faber, had obviously hidden a book away in his jacket. They talked for a bit, and Faber even recited poetry to him. The old man had a spark in him, and when he left Montag, he'd written his address on a piece of paper and handed it to the fireman saying, "For your file, in case you decide to be angry with me." Montag had held on to that piece of paper and decided now was the time to visit Faber. When he arrives, Montag isn't greeted with open arms. Faber, a former English professor, is naturally skeptical, but Montag is able to convince him that he's sincere in his newfound enlightenment. In fact, Montag is eager to enlist Faber to help him out of his current predicament. Montag doesn't know what to do about his wife or his job. Captain Beatty was offering him a way out when he said that all he needed to do was bring the book back to the firehouse and burn it. But Montag also knows that he's helpless against his boss's rhetoric. If he returns to work, Montag is worried he'll go back to the dark side, as it were. But if he doesn't return to work, he'd basically be admitting his guilt. More than anything else, Montag wants to be part of the resistance, to help spread the ideas and get people to reconnect with the world and their fellow people. This gets Faber excited as well, the most excited he's been in a very long time. So Faber gives Montag an earpiece that allows him to both hear what Montag is hearing and to speak to Montag from the safety of his house. The plan is that Faber will be able to whisper into Montag's ear and help him resist Beatty's temptations. Alas, things don't exactly go to plan. When he returns home, he finds that Mildred and 2 of her friends have gotten together in the TV parlor. He tries to engage these women, as he knows their husbands have been drafted into the military and haven't been heard from in some time. But they refuse to be concerned. Then, Montag grabs a book and recites a poem, even though Faber is in his ear telling him to stop. The poem causes one of the visitors to leave the house in tears, and Montag buries the book of poetry in the yard for safety. He brings another book to work with him and makes a show of putting it in the incinerator. His superior Beatty welcomes Montag, but it turns out it's all a ruse. Soon, the alarm goes off and Montag is sent out to burn some books. He doesn't realize what's going on until they arrive at his own house. Analysis. The interesting thing about this part of the story is that, indirectly, we get a better idea of what's really happening in this future world. In the previous section, Captain Beatty told us that it was the will of the people that had resulted in firemen burning books. In his version, books were a source of pointless confusion, so people rejected them in favor of hedonistic pleasures. But as we hear about the bombers flying overhead and the cycle of war that appears to be ongoing, Beatty's version falls apart. The more likely scenario is the one Montag has stumbled upon, that society has been set up to prevent people from asking questions. As the books went away, history went away, only to be replaced by a false history that normalizes the current oppression. One of the reasons Fahrenheit 451 continues to be relevant today is because this rewriting of history continues to be a hot-button political issue in different parts of the world. Here we see it being used hand-in-hand with technology that keeps people in a comfortable bubble, so much so that they're not even upset when family members are sent to die in a war that they know nothing about. It's a chilling concept, and one that remains as relevant as ever. In the next section, we'll wrap up the story on an optimistic note. We'll consider how the fearmongers and warmongers tend to bring about their own demise, and how this can offer us a light at the end of the tunnel. The Keepers of the Word. The third and final part of the story starts with a climactic confrontation. Montag learns that his wife had told the authorities about the books, so he complies with Beatty's orders and burns everything in his own house. But when Beatty finds Montag's earpiece and threatens to track down Faber, Montag turns the salamander on his boss and sets him on fire, killing him. Montag rescues the book he buried in the yard and makes a run for it. He's nearly killed by a police car, but Montag escapes and makes it to Faber's house undetected. Faber tells him there are exiles outside the city. He gives Montag directions: go to the river and follow it to the train tracks. There are communities along the tracks, people like Montag, and with a little luck, he might find them. It does take some luck. There are helicopters, and a vicious mechanical hound is on the loose, tracking his scent. With the robot hound right on his heels, Montag avoids capture by jumping into the river and letting the current take him away. He's able to stay under long enough for the police to lose track of him. After some distance, he leaves the safety of the water, spots the railroad tracks, and continues his journey away from the city, which gets smaller and smaller on the horizon behind him. And, just as Faber had described, he comes across a community of exiles. As Montag is introduced to the people in the camp, he learns that most of them are former teachers, scholars, and writers. They believe that the war will soon be over and that together they will be able to rebuild. One person is an expert on the works of Marcus Aurelius, another on Jonathan Swift, another on Charles Darwin, and so on. Within them, the flame is kept alive, and the knowledge from these writings will once again burn bright. Indeed, as they stand together in the camp, the bombs start falling on the city on the horizon. At that moment, Montag remembers how he met his wife, and he cries out for Mildred. In an instant, the city is gone. One of the men in the camp mentions the story of the phoenix. As that tale went, the phoenix would burn to ashes, but then rise from those ashes, only to be burnt again. The difference is, this time, they will rise and rebuild, but they won't burn again. Unlike the phoenix, they'll know what went wrong the last time, and they won't burn again. Final summary. This is a story about a dystopian future, wherein all books are banned. Rather than extinguish fires, the firemen in this reality extinguish poems, literature, and facts. In doing so, they've erased history and the power of the written word, which helps us to engage with nature, people, and the world around us. One fireman, Guy Montag, is prompted to start asking questions about his life, and he begins to read and hide books at his home. When his wife finds out and his boss becomes suspicious, things quickly spiral out of control. Montag seeks help from a retired English professor, but he is soon forced to burn his own house and go on the run. In exile, Montag finds a community of people who are keeping history and the written word alive in their minds. As the city is destroyed in war, the community is prepared to rebuild and not make the same mistakes. Thanks for listening to the Speed Read. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more summaries like this. Thanks for watching.